Welcome to Command Control Power, a weekly podcast hosted by 3 certified members of the Apple Consultants Network, drawing from over half a century of combined experience. We talk shop, interview vendors and colleagues, and share what we've learned while operating our technology consulting practices. This is Joe Saponari of SciMac, and my 2 co-hosts are Jerry Zigman of MacWorks and Sam Valencia of the HCS Technology Group. For the freshest content, a peek behind the scenes, and more candid conversation about running our businesses, dealing with clients, fixing tough technical issues, and everything else you love about Command Control Power, we invite you to join us on Patreon so you don't miss any of this great content. Go to commandcontrolpower.com and click support. Pledge monthly, and you can instantly subscribe to the patron-only shows right in your favorite podcast app. Once again, to join us on Patreon and get the latest patron-only episodes, visit commandcontrolpower.com and click support. We hope to see you there, and thanks for listening.
I was in the kitchen the other day with my wife, and we were just talking, about something random, and I happened to have my phone in my hand. And I got a message, and I took a screenshot. Actually, it came up twice. I didn't capture the screenshot the first time, but I got a legit message that said, "Do you want to share your screen with AppleCare?" And there was decline or accept. And yeah, wait, what? I did not make any request for AppleCare support under my Apple ID on my phone. And I remember what happened. It actually disappeared before I could do anything about it. And then I was like, that's very sketchy. And then my phone was locked a few minutes later, and I got the message on my lock screen that also said AppleCare, share your screen with AppleCare. And so I tapped it, and it brought me to the typical accept decline where I was able to capture a screenshot at that point. And not doing anything about it, it also went away after a few moments. But it caused me to log into my Apple ID to check things to see if there were any crazy logins. I changed my password, have 2-step verification and everything, but with a trusted device and everything that you should be doing. But it really caused me to pause there. And I haven't reached out to support to say, hey, did you guys run any sort of a test that may have gone out incorrectly? But I didn't get any follow-up. Normally when that kind of a thing happens, like a mailing list goes awry or something like that, you usually get an email from the vendor saying, sorry about that, we screwed up.
But I haven't
seen anything like that either.
Then they follow up, how did we do?
Yeah, give us 1 to 5 stars.
Yeah. That's weird, man. So, was the screenshot, did it look pretty legitimate?
Completely legitimate.
Yeah.
And the lock screen message is also legitimate. It's got the typical AppleCare logo, the white box with the red apple in it, which I've seen and used. And it was amongst my other messages, but there was nothing that would have prompted it. No one in my family made a request. There was nothing like that. And it only showed up on my phone.
Oh.
I think I'm being hacked, Joe.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I would definitely clean up those icons on your desktop right away, run Norton Disk Doctor, whatever you got to do. But no, that's really sketchy. That would really concern me too. The only other thing I'm wondering is because, as you've said in the past, that you've set up lots of client Apple IDs for testing or whatever else for classes and things. Using your phone, it's not hooked to your Apple ID, but I don't know, something about the fact that your phone could have been a trusted device for somebody else's. I don't really know how that would come into play, though.
I suppose there's that possibility, but I really didn't use my phone. The only function of my phone was for the number for 2-step. So it wasn't signed into using another Apple ID where it would then end up on the trusted device list. So I don't know. I could see this if it was on one of my iPad devices because those are used for testing sometimes, and maybe that was an issue, but definitely not on my phone. So I really do have to follow up and ask them because I am curious to see what they say because I have a timestamp where we can investigate it, but I just haven't.
Well, I definitely am curious about that. Suspiciously, Jerry is not on this call. So did it say anything about MacWorks? Maybe
It said applesupportmac.com. I think that's one of Jerry's domains.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, that's certainly sketchy. That would sketch me out a little bit too. Let us know what you find out. Hopefully it's something pretty innocuous and weird. Probably still interesting though.
Yeah, I'm hoping that I will get, we had some reports where a message went out inadvertently. Our apologies. That's what I'm hoping for. Yeah.
I don't want to say it could be a rogue employee at Apple or something. In theory, man. Just like clicking some buttons and I don't know. Yeah, that's strange. I'd be curious certainly if any listeners, but if any clients have reported that to listeners.
Please let us know. If you hear this and you're, that happened to me the other day, I would love to hear from you. And I will report back if I do reach out to AppleCare to see what's going on there.
So I have a Synology saga story. This was related to a client's Synology, which originally we configured as a residential backup server. And this is a high-end residential client who has this big kind of place. And we had installed this Synology backup server. And ultimately, I think the client added onto it file storage. His AV person had said at one point, is there a system you have somewhere in your home where we could do file sharing between some of the Windows stuff that the AV person handles and to give the client access to it from his Mac as well? And he said, I think you guys installed a server, right? So the client was asking me. So we said, yeah, I mean, you can use this also for file sharing. We probably wouldn't have spec'd this exact server if you wanted to do file sharing. We would have also had a backup on the server. We should add a backup to it, maybe offsite backup. What's the data? And he said, it's just temporary things. It's not important data, but it's just like something to give me quick access to it or whatever. So we're like, yeah, sure. So we set that up as well. And it's been working for a number of years. We replaced a drive at one point when something happened. And so it's just been chugging along. And we're on a phone call with something else, with this client about something else. And he said, so I can't get to that shared folder anymore. And the backups were failing, which we had noticed. We were beginning to investigate that. And he mentioned the file sharing thing. So I thought, okay, maybe it's got to be something on the server, not just the usual time machine issues. So I noticed I could not get into the server remotely. I'm like, that's weird. Maybe it's down. What's going on? And so I connected to his Mac, and I was able to get to the server locally using the IP address to the Synology. So this is interesting. I wonder why the remote access is not working. So he starts to share a little more info. And he said, so a cleaning person was vacuuming or something and bumped into the server and it started beeping. I guess a drive had popped out. So I looked into it and I'm like, this is not good. So this is already bad.
You never want to hear a story that starts with the cleaning people may have hit something.
Right. Like physically bumping the server, drive popping out, beeping, all those things sound bad. And I'm like, this is even weirder because the server is behind this glass fronted room, this equipment room that was basically spec'd and managed by this. It's a high-end AV company who we work with for other clients, and they're good to work with. And people walk past it when he's showing people around his home. They walk past us when they're going to the entertainment center or theater place in the basement of the home. And he can show it off. This is my data center in my home.
Yeah.
So why is there even a cleaning person in your data center in the first place? All of this just sounds very strange.
It's a security breach.
Yeah. So I looked into it. I figured it out. I got it to stop beeping. I looked it up online. I had to pull the drives out and start it up without the drives installed. Why? What? Yeah. On earth would ever cause you to just start following some random instructions about pulling drives out of your server? Should that not give you pause?
This is all bad.
Yeah, this is bad and getting worse. And then I'm thinking, why didn't I get alerts about this degraded RAID from the Synology? We should certainly have gotten alerts about this. So I'm beginning to speculate about that. I'm like, why? This is weird. I have local access. So I'm going in to investigate that. And I'm asking him a little bit. And he goes, oh, we switched our ISP in the house. So I wonder, could that be related? Now, this is a managed service client. He pays monthly. We're in touch all the time. Like, why wouldn't he have at least just heads up, I changed ISPs?
Yeah, I see where this is going, but yeah.
So it's like clearly, okay, so the Synology stopped being able to reach the internet because the old DNS servers were in there, which were no longer valid on the new ISP. So that was an easy solution, but that also meant that we didn't get any alerts about the real problems that were going on. He wasn't placing any blame, thankfully, because I was ready to go back at him on that, but that was the issue. And it was running DSM-6 also, so it was due for an upgrade, and it was doing locally sent email alerts through Synology, where they used to support a push service where the Synology would report to Synology headquarters that there's an issue, and Synology would send us the email. So, that was another kind of issue there. Ultimately, we did get it upgraded. I'm just beginning to investigate what happened here, what's the current status. So then he said it's beeping again as I'm looking at it. And he said, can you make the beeping stop? I'm like, yeah, but let me figure out why it's beeping here first.
Just stop.
Because making it stop is not really a solution. Yeah. So I did mute the beep, obviously, and reconfigure the network settings so we could get back through it remotely, kind of digging a little bit further. So I, of course, look at the drives and I see here's the status after his client self-guided fix, quote unquote fix. So drive number 1 showed failing. So I'm like, okay, maybe that was one that got popped out. Maybe it's just a coincidence and we weren't notified because of the remote access issue. Drive number 2 was okay. Drive number 3 was reporting incorrectly formatted, unable to access the system partition. So I don't know, maybe that's because it got replaced after starting up the Synology with fewer drives installed. I don't know what his exact process was. So
Yeah.
drive 3 is now incorrectly formatted. And then drive number 4 was the same issue as drive number 3. And both number 3 and 4 were not part of the Synology RAID volume anymore. Okay, so this is a fully degraded RAID at this point. Now, of course, like all servers, even backup servers, we set them up with RAID 6, which Synology calls whatever SHR2, 2-drive redundancy. So the data was all still accessible. And I was like, this is a miracle because drive number 1 is failing and drive 3 and 4 were not part of the RAID anymore. So data is accessible, but drive number 1 is showing failing. DSM suggested repairing the file system. So that's what it's telling you to do because the 2 drives are not part of the RAID anymore. I only selected drive number 3 because also drive number 4 was reporting bad blocks at this point. So that could be valid. It actually has bad blocks, or that could be because it was inserted and removed at the wrong times or whatever. But obviously now I don't trust drive 4 either. So drive 1 and drive 4 are now failing. So the volume starts repairing to drive 3. So this is going to rebuild it to 1 level of redundancy, basically. So we have him order drives. We go on site. And of course, to install these drives, you have to put them in a carrier and then pop them in. So we wanted to do this with minimal downtime, obviously, but minimal on-site back and forth. So we first confirmed that the volume is repaired successfully. So it's on drive 1, 2, and 3 at this point. We then replaced drive number 1, which was noted as failing. So you replace it, you add it to the volume, and you start the volume repair. So now it's rebuilding redundancy onto the new drive number 1 and also still using drive 2 and 3. Then for the same on-site, we found we can pull drive 4 because it's not part of the volume anyway, because it has bad blocks. So we might as well just put in the fresh drive now, even though we can't yet start the rebuild there. Put that in on the same on-site. And then the rest was all done remotely. So we confirmed after a day or whatever, drive 1, 2, and 3 are now healthy. Volume is finished repairing. So those drives were actually all fine. Drive number 1 was replaced and new. We added drive number 4 to that volume and started the volume repair. So now after another day, now you have redundancy across all 4 drives. We ran the extended smart test at that point and just made sure everything was all good to go after following up to the results of those tests. And then we lastly upgraded DSM and we enrolled it in our Synology CMS host for remote monitoring. So I was just amazed that, first of all, that data was still accessible. It's 4 drives in the array and 2 were not part of the array anymore and 1 was failing. And yet all the data was still recovered as far as we know. We didn't get any reports of files being corrupted or missing or backups being problematic or anything like that. So that was
bullet, Joe.
Yeah, we really did. And it's a big win for Synology with their RAID recovery. It was just really, they made it easy. And it was not their fault that any of this happened. It was clearly what the client did and how he got it to that point. But yeah, it's a big win.
And that's the hybrid RAID that you're talking about, right? The SHR2.
SHR2, exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty slick. Obviously, that kind of stuff freaks me out. That's the type of stuff I lose sleep over is data loss. But the fact that you were able to come back from that and the fact it's just making me laugh that it starts with a cleaning crew knocking something loose and then, him popping out drives. Like, how much worse could you get with that situation?
Exactly. And it's not like we don't regularly talk to him and he's on a monthly plan. There's no reason that we shouldn't have been notified at that time and asked, what should I do? This happened. It's beeping or something. So the whole thing was just ridiculous and it could have been much worse. And I think he knows he could have got himself into more trouble. But it was also just a really good demonstration of why have RAID 6, even for a backup server, because I don't want to have to start the backups over if I can avoid it. We have the historical backup data there. It was just less invasive to be able to rebuild. It definitely was very protective in this situation. And he does have those other files. He's been using it for some kind of file sharing that we're not as involved in. And I once again took the opportunity to say, this stuff should be backed up. Do you have a backup of this? And he says, yeah, the AV guys has some kind of backup of this. So I'm like, okay.
Whatever you say. Yeah. We've talked about Synology a number of times over the years, and I still have them in a variety of locations. And then there's the other side where we're doing either a combination of that and cloud or just cloud too. So I'm actually I don't want to say struggling, but I'm trying to figure out best workflows for things like that too, where we have OneDrive data and an employee gets laid off or fired or leaves the organization. And then the correct process for offboarding their data, for moving it to a SharePoint site. With one organization, for example, we have a SharePoint site for, I think we call it archive users, and then the data goes in there. But prior to that, there was no real process for this company, and internally they would delete users. And then what was happening, this is not related to Synology, it's just made me think of the cloud-based approach too. But I found this interesting, is this was before they really embraced SharePoint as the central storage point. So a user's on OneDrive and he's working on an important billing document and he shares it with other people. So it's in his OneDrive, shared to others. That employee leaves the organization one day and internally they delete that user. The other users keep working on that document until all of a sudden, one day, it's just inaccessible. And that's because it hit that 93-day window, I believe, where the data would normally be retained on Microsoft servers. Now, technically, I think that data shouldn't be shareable anymore once you delete the user, but we've seen time and time again that it actually is. So then you have to trace back, who was deleted and where did it belong? Where was that person? Where would they exist? And I've seen that happen a number of times before we started taking over offboarding processes. And that's very scary to think about. We have Backupify, and that's been saving the day. But it's very scary to think about that you can have a deleted user and nobody knows that data that they're linking to because they just have a URL that they go to for Microsoft Online. That one day it's just poof, years of data is just gone.
Oh, wow.
You haven't come across this, have you, where that's happened in your situations?
No, thankfully I haven't. But yeah, I'd hear you about offboarding in general. It's certainly better when we handle it. But even then, sometimes there's legacy stuff where sometimes hard to account for that. They might look at it and say, what does this email mean that this data is going to be deleted if it's not reassigned or moved or whatever?
Yeah.
They think it's irrelevant. But yeah, like to your point, it could be where a whole folder is that everybody uses.
Thankfully, we've had things in place like Backupify, but some of this happened before that was in place because Backupify isn't necessarily cheap if you're a semi-large organization. So what would happen is like this one company said, fine, we'll do Backupify, but just for the C-level employees, for the important people. And then what happened? A user left. They weren't C-level. They weren't an executive. They had important data and it was not backed up. So I said, now do you want to do Backupify for the whole company? Of course, they learn trial by fire and they do it. But in other situations, you might be caught, or we might have been caught where a user got deleted. They were not there. That's happened with this. I'm just thinking of one client in particular. So I'm putting it out there as a PSA is unless you train end users properly, they're going to use crap wrong. That's just all there is to it. And this organization, just because they grew and grew, didn't have a proper process in place and they didn't know where their stuff was. And now they're finding out the hard way that stuff is disappearing, literally disappearing. In the last 3 months, that's happened, I think, 4 times. So it's crazy, man. It's crazy.
Yeah, because again, users will do what's easy. And if they're comfortable just going into OneDrive and making a folder and then sharing it because someone else asks for it or just because they're the one who originates the data or whatever, so they just do what they think works. So what would be the guidance on that? Would it be to use the company's SharePoint server to create the folder and then share it out from there, I guess?
Yeah, as opposed to sharing it from a user. That could be like one way, but like, hey, take a look at this document and then maybe for collaboration briefly. But I find that users just forget in the end where the data is or that they even shared it in the first place. And then it becomes a really scary thought because going back to even not using OneDrive, the other piece of it is the people that are just keeping their data on their local computer when there's no backups. We've talked about Backblaze and Time Machine, and I think you guys probably back up more workstations than I do. And to that, you're safer in that respect. But we've tried to push along with the companies that we're working with, hey, if you're not in the cloud, you're not on the server, then you're SOL. But that also can bite you in the ass. Even if you have that as a policy and all the companies know it, if some random employee didn't do what they were supposed to and their hard drive dies, who are they looking towards, right? Yep. That is a scary thing too, but I think that the cloud or central approach is an easier management point. It just, how do you prevent an employee from doing the wrong thing?
Yeah.
It's hard.
Oh, that's the age-old question about anything. Even when the boss signs off on it, because I think you've gotten this answer before too, and I know I have, where the boss will say, if they're not putting it on the server where they're supposed to, then that's their problem. And it's not just their problem. It could cost the business lost productivity. Sure, what's your recourse? If this employee cost us time, fire them. But still, you don't get the time back. You don't get the client back that you lost because you lost their project that now you're going to miss their deadline or something.
Yeah.
So you can't just put the onus back on the employee. Sure, you can have those protocols in place and you can train people, but yeah, there's nothing like just having that protection on the endpoint basis and also all the servers. And then now you're pointing out the OneDrive edge case. At least you can cover that in your offboarding protocols, which you don't always get involved in. So it's tricky. And it also speaks to the level of comfort you have to have when you're switching best practices. We all got really comfortable with on-premises servers for a long time, whether it was a Mac hosting direct attached storage, sharing it out over the network and using VPN to access it, or now a Synology doing the same thing. That's like a familiar platform for us to manage, where you can centrally back up the server both locally and offsite if you want. And that's all well and good. But then as you move more to all cloud, people think it's in the cloud, but you still have to account for that. How are we backing up this cloud provider now? So we've gotten into this recently with Dropbox, where clients have just used Dropbox Business or whatever they call it for Teams, share their data. And we're not totally comfortable just relying on Backblaze. They have good backups built in. You can recover deleted files and things. What if the internet is down? That kind of thing. So we also like to set up a local backup of Dropbox. And sometimes it's the company's data is multiple terabytes. And so you designate a workstation for that and you use external storage to store the Dropbox folder, which now my understanding is you can't do anymore, or it's not actually supported by Dropbox. Have you seen this yet, where they're now migrating you to that relations method of storing the data, and it only supports storing it essentially in the user's library?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I haven't stored it outside of there, so I guess I haven't run into it, but that's interesting.
Yeah, the built-in mechanism obviously is to create the Dropbox folder in the user's home folder. And then if you're using that method and you're running like 12.6, I think 3 or 12.6.4 or newer, Dropbox app will launch and say, we're ready to migrate you to this new thing. For a long time, they weren't quote unquote ready for Monterey. And you'd maybe get these calls where clients have files in Dropbox that are not synced locally because they're not made available offline. If you're in the Finder, you just see the files, you double click it, it downloads and it opens. But if you're in a third-party app, like you're in Adobe InDesign or something, and you go into File Open, and you navigate to your Dropbox, and you go to open the file, it doesn't open from that way, because the kernel extension that they used to use is obviously no longer supported, so it doesn't have a way to tell Dropbox to download the file and make it available for the app to open it. So the workaround is go to the Finder and open it, or just make everything available offline. Now, Dropbox is ready to support that fully, and they're using Apple's file provider framework to change the Dropbox location to locations, I think, is like the section in the sidebar. And right. Yeah, so like behind the scenes, it moves it from the home folder to the library, to the user's library folder somewhere, I believe. So that all is handled pretty straightforward and works fine if it's just a basic use like that. But if you have a massive amount of data that's in a non-standard Dropbox location, it's not clear to me how it's going to handle that, because if you look at their site, they officially don't support that anymore. So I don't know that you can have a large Dropbox being backed up locally unless you have internal storage that can support it. I certainly don't want to mess with symlinks to point that to an external location. So
yeah, could you sync? Well, you could sync that to like your Dropbox data to like a Synology. So as opposed to a local computer is what you're saying.
That's a good. Is there a client on Synology? I guess I know there probably was, right?
I think so, because what we were doing for a while is we were syncing SharePoint data to the Synology. So I'm pretty sure it does it for Dropbox and some other services.
Okay, that's a good thought.
Yeah, it could be a good alternative, especially as they're locking down that mechanism on Mac OS.
Yeah, that's a good point. We'll take a look at that. There's also third-party Dropbox clients that have more features, so that's the other alternative. I forget. They're free and seem to work well, in theory, from reports. I haven't used it myself. Yeah,
I think that's the other alternative, is looking at those third-party solutions and seeing if they can fill the gap that is now created by this change in how Dropbox is going to work on the Mac side. It's always a tricky business doing what we do.
Yeah, it's always a bunch of moving targets. Like we talked recently about the software updates, moving target, and various apps that are moving targets. I feel at least that Apple has stabilized on some of the major architectural changes between the APFS transition a few years ago and kernel extensions. We had the 64-bit transition prior to that. So there's been some major things like that I really think Apple is paving the way for like better stability in the future. But it still feels like we're very much relearning best practices on an almost weekly basis for how to manage all this stuff. And it's tricky. It takes a lot of time to stay on top of this stuff.
Oh, yeah. Just one quick example is BitDefender, which some of our clients use and we deployed via MDM. They ran into an issue where just Bitdefender started popping up as needing full disk access, even though we approved it ages ago. And so we start looking online and we contact support. They're like, oh, yeah, Apple changed things. And it feels like Apple's an afterthought to this company, by the way. But they're like, you're going to have to reapprove what you already approved for full disk access. And
really?
Like, what? And then you got to, if you use our content filter, you're going to have to install the certificate manually because it's trusting the old one. And it's like a nightmare. And I'm like, you know what? I think I'm going to leave you guys. Like, I don't want to deal with this. This is poor planning on your part. It feels like this didn't happen to any other anti-malware, antivirus vendors that we worked with. What gives?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's not like everybody went through that for that same issue. So that is annoying. It certainly felt that way with Dropbox too, with this whole thing where they were not quote unquote ready for Monterey. And it's like you had a lot of time to think about that and plan for that. And it's not like Mac is this afterthought of a platform anymore either. It's like they're pretty widely used at this point.
Yeah. I did have to stop somebody on a call this was a client or that was heading up this project, and the project only would support Windows systems for their kiosks. And his Windows computers are far more, what did he say? It was like far more craved over, or I forget the terminology he used. It was like a weird terminology. It wasn't like preferred. It was like a weird word over the Apple platform. I'm going to stop you right there. We got into it a little bit. That's not entirely true, but people think the way they think. Sometimes it's antiquated.
Yeah, you got to update your internal reference for that. It's not 2002 anymore. Come on.
Yeah.
As we wrap up the show, I want to just call listeners' attention to some recent patron-only content. We mentioned, of course, the Tim Pearson Show. We talk about that all the time. That's like a classic, ageless kind of episode for motivating you to get on board with the latest best practices on managing your clients and how you price your services and present your service offerings. So that's a huge value right there. Also, we discussed a few shows back in the Patreon feed an on-the-job injury that affected, I'll just leave it mysterious, a member of someone's team, let's put it that way. And we discussed implications of an on-the-job injury and how it affects productivity and navigating insurance. That's something that may be interesting to people. And also what it's like to take a vacation as a sole proprietor. Jerry shared his experience with that from a recent trip, and all reflected on the kind of, Sam and I reflected on before and after. We've taken vacations on the sole proprietor method versus having a team and how that changes and pros and cons of that. Lots of great patron-only content there for listeners to check out if you support us on Patreon. So go to commandcontrolpower.com and click on support, and you can pledge any amount to become a patron and have access to the entire back catalog of all the patron-only episodes. I've also shared a couple of other things there, like the Watchman Monitoring client review template in Numbers. So you can export from Watchman Monitoring and just copy and paste it into my Numbers template that then formats everything really nicely, calls attention to machines that have less than optimal memory, that are running low on storage space, that are running outdated Mac OS versions, things like that. So it's a really quick and easy reference that you can actually just copy and paste then from there into an email to your client, or just use it for your own reference when having that review call with your client. So that's on there as well. Lots of great stuff on our Patreon only content. So check us out at commandcontrolpower.com, click on support, and pledge monthly on Patreon. And we'd really love to have your support and for you to let us know what you think about that special content as well.
I wasn't sure if there'd be a good place for this since we're very lighthearted, but someone in the community had passed away that I wanted to at least mention. I wanted to take a moment out of the show today to pay my respects to a colleague that some of you might know. Bill Keogh, he was the owner of NovaWorks in Manhattan, which was an Apple certified training facility where I taught for many years. That's where I earned my chops and learned my way. And Bill was a great person to deal with. I've known him over the years. He retired from the business and moved out of New York City a few years ago and actually moved into the suburbs where I currently live. But he was a good individual, very lighthearted, and his company, NovaWorks, was very Apple focused. And a lot of us got our certifications through his facility and may have passed ways with him and shook his hand. And I just wanted to take a moment to pay my respects to his family and offer condolences and just say that he was well respected in the community.
Jerry does his voices of customers of all kinds.
Am I on the cloud?
Joe spins his deeply detailed yarns all the time.
I have a whole story about this.
Sam is on the road again, phoning in from a hotel.
At least we know where I am.
Half a century combined of Apple expertise right now. Right now. My Mac is slow.